a new consulting firm. It's called Unicost as Associate Director in GRC. So let's start. Enough about me. Let's start with the webinar. So what is the objective of the webinar? Is to understand mainly about fraud risk management guide. We'll start with the basics. What is fraud? Is intentional deception. What is fraud triangle, fraud risk, and fraud tree. Then we'll go deep about what is fraud risk principle, management principle, the program, because from the principle we'll build a fraud risk management program, what should be the component of this fraud risk management program. And what is important here also is the ACFE tools that we have to implement the fraud risk management guide and to have proper fraud risk management program in our organization. So at the end of the webinar, ACFE Lebanon Chapter will share with you some tools from ACFE regarding fraud risk assessment, fraud risk guide, fraud risk examples, fraud risk management policy as well, and survey where you can use, take it, customize it, and use it within your organization. So yes, we're gonna have overview about this topic because it's a long topic. It will be only 1 hour. However, the tools you will use, you will take and use it within your organization. So, Fraud Risk Management Guide, the second edition. So, what happened in 2000? First, COSO, Committee of Sponsoring Organization, it was established in 1985. In 1992, they released the first COSO internal control framework, and then it was updated in 2013. From the COSO 2013 second edition, there were 5 components and 17 principles. One of the factors why the COSO Fraud Risk Management Guide was published is there is component risk assessment, component number 2, which have the principle 8, which it's about was fraud risk consideration. Here, they built up from this principle to have a practical guide for fraud risk management guide. And then second edition was released in 2023, which we are talking about now in this webinar. Why fraud risk matter? So in every organization, there's potential fraud. Fraud risk exists. When organizations want to make profit, the bottom line, and when the CEO or the chief financial officer are struggling to reach performance targets or professional or profits, so here potential fraud might exist. This is why fraud risk matters. Again, fraud is intentional, it's changing, it's evolving, it's not static. Now with the AI, fraud risk is coming more often, new technology happening, different changes. Then with fraud, we have financial losses, we have reputational damage. This is when a fraud happen in an organization, you see in all the media, and this is the hardest part for any organization to suffer from fraud. Regarding financial loss, the ACFE have released that 5% of revenue is gone for fraud within the organization. And regulatory bodies, for example, the authorities in Gulf countries that are responsible for public listed companies, what's happening these days, they are being more strict with public listed companies. They are giving more fines, more penalties. They are concentrating on fraud, conflict of interest with board members, audit committees. And we've seen last year they released a lot of fines even on big audit firms, especially, for example, in Qatar, which was in the public. And when the fraud happens, what happened with the stakeholders, shareholders, client, vendors, and employees? They lose trust. The reputation of the organization is gone. So we're going to talk about fraud. What is fraud? Fraud is intentional. So it's intentional deception. It's an intentional act or omission or designed to deceive whom? The victim. So the fraudster will make an intentional act to deceive the victim to make profit, and the victim will have loss. What is different between fraud and error? Error, error is unintentional. However, fraud is intentional. What are the type of fraud? we have four major type of fraud. So we have the financial statement fraud. We're gonna talk in the next slide about fraud three. Then we have the asset misappropriation. This is where inventory, cash, or asset is being stolen. We have corruption. Gonna talk about bribery, about illegal gratuity, and then we have the external fraud, cybersecurity, hacking, vendors, client, competitors. For example, in the competitors, what they do, we have something called corporate espionage. The vendor might do also collusion, overbilling. So this is when we talk about the external fraud, which is important factor as well. So we should consider internal fraud done by the employees within the process because we have, we'll see based on the fraud triangle. And the external fraud also is a key major, is important for the fraud categories. What is the fraud tree? Who studied have CFE or is studying now to pursue the CFE certification, he have studied the fraud tree within the financial transaction and fraud scheme. So we have the corruption, bribery, conflict of interest. This is why now even the board of directors in public listed companies have to sign declaration of conflict of interest. Even the chief level, this is for example was updated last year in Qatar within corporate governance code. Bribery is very important, kickbacks, illegal gratuity, misappropriation of assets, where we can, when employee steal cash, when we have employee goes in the payroll scheme. Why the fraud tree is important? We're gonna see later on that the fraud tree should be part of the brainstorming sessions when we are doing our fraud risk assessment, when we are sitting interviewing the risk champion or the risk owner, where we should have it in front of us in the sheet and considering each element of these payrolls, if the schemes, billing scheme, payroll scheme, check tampering, all these schemes should be considered while preparing the fraud risk register. And we have the financial statement fraud. This is at the, we call it white collar crime. This is where the C level, the senior management, maybe they are doing collusion because also they have pressure and the company want to show that they are making profit. This is where they can make overstating revenue, understating expenses and liabilities within using time difference, where they will record, for example, a revenue in February 2026. However, they will record it in December 2025 to overstate the revenue within the financial statement fraud. So this is regarding the fraud tree. Fraud triangle. We all heard about this fraud triangle: pressure, opportunity, and rationalization. So when we talk about pressure, this is when an employee have performance targets or financial goals. A salesperson have sales target, sometimes also collection from client targets. So this is pressure is very important, where someone also individual have uh, personal pressure. He have financial difficulties. He want to live in a certain environment and he cannot afford it. He will do make fraud, and we have seen it practically in Qatar, where people were really having pressure and they committed fraud because of that element. I'm gonna show you later on a fraud risk register that I prepared myself, and I put this fraud triangle, uh, uh, these fraud triangles within the fraud risk register, so I can know each fraud risk is coming from which component of the fraud triangle. Then we have the opportunity. This is where we have weak internal controls. We don't have strong preventive controls. We don't have segregation of duties. We trust our employees. We give them a lot of authorities. We don't have detective controls. And the opportunity is this is where we can, the companies can put controls to reduce it. However, pressure, we cannot control it. The company don't have the power to control pressure, but the opportunity, the company can improve controls to reduce the opportunity. When we show the individuals that there is punishment, there is accountability, and there is strong controls, it's hard to make fraud. Then we have the rationalization. I'm in the company for the last 10 years. In the last 4 years, I'm not getting any increment. I work overtime, they are not paying me. This is when we talk about rationalization. My colleagues are getting promotion and they are not working hard as me, and my deliverables is the same or even better. This is rationalization. So when these three elements are combined together, this is where we see fraud risk. We're gonna see it in the next slide. So what is fraud risk? It is the when an organization vulnerability face when a person combine all these elements of the fraud triangle. This is the definition of fraud risk as per ACFE. So we're gonna talk now about we have inherent fraud risk and residual fraud risk. We're gonna see it's the same inherent and residual even without the terminology fraud. So what is inherent risk? It's the risk before the effect of internal controls. So first, when we'll start preparing our risk register, we're gonna uh, describe the risk. I prefer to use the bow tie model, which is I put the event, the cause, and the consequence. So we're gonna describe the risk. This risk first, we're gonna put the inherent risk. After we put the inherent risk and we prioritize it, we evaluated likelihood and impact, we will go and put the existing controls, and then what we'll have, we will have the residual risk. This is the risk that remain after the effect of the existing controls. What is the objective here is to have the residual risk, of course, less the inherent risk. So we cannot go and see risk register where we can see inherent risk high, residual risk is high as well. So here the control is ineffective. We should change the control, put mitigation plan. Or some risk register will have inherent risk medium, residual risk high. It's of course it's an error by mistake. So this is when we talk about inherent and residual fraud risk. So we'll start now with the COSO fraud risk management principle. This is the main principle. So from the principles, we will build on later on the fraud risk management program. So fraud risk governance. Before we talk about the fraud risk part, what is governance? Governance is having a strong control environment, a slick to control environment, entity level control. It is when we have independent board of directors, when we have charters, when we have bylaws, when there is proper reporting and organization structure, when we have accountability, code of ethics, code of conduct, when we hire competent employees. This is all part of governance. So fraud risk governance, what we're gonna add on it is having, so part of governance also having risk management function, internal audit department. What we're gonna add here is fraud risk management policy. So if you are not talking about fraud risk governance, usually it is risk management policy. However, here we're gonna talk about fraud risk management policy, and we'll see some ACFE tools, the component of fraud risk management policy, where we'll share with you at the end of the webinar as well. Then we're gonna talk about fraud risk assessment. So in this principle is linked to the risk assessment, the cause internal control framework risk assessment component. And this is again why it was created, why one of the factors that this guide was created. So here we are considering fraud risk. Again, fraud risk is the vulnerability of an organization that might occur based if an individual will have the fraud risk, the fraud triangle together, combined together. So in fraud risk assessment, we're gonna identify fraud risk, fraud schemes, and what is the fraud control, what the anti-fraud controls, what the controls should be there to mitigate it. And we're gonna evaluate this risk based on impact and likelihood. Of course, we start with inherent and continue to residual risk, and then we'll put the mitigation plan. So here we're gonna see some examples of fraud risk registers from ACFE and another example that I prepared especially for this webinar. Then we're gonna talk about fraud control activity. So if we don't have fraud in place, we'll say we should have internal control policy and framework, part of the governance, and then we should have internal control policy and framework, which I created when I was in a public listed company. However, here we call it fraud control activity. We concentrate on controls that will prevent fraud from happening. The preventive control, strong preventive control, segregation of duties. This component is linked to the control activity within COSO internal control framework. And we should have also detective controls. We have also a ACFE tool we're going to share with you. Then we're going to talk about fraud investigation and corrective actions. Here we should have, for example, I have seen a public listed company from a committee from the board of directors. They called it Investigation and Disciplinary Action Committee. So there was a clear charter and policy and process. If an investigation happened, who should be the team members and the reporting line where the fraud investigation team should give a report and recommendation to that committee, and they will take a decision, a corrective action about that fraud and that case. Then fraud risk monitoring activity. So at the end of the cycle, we should monitor if the fraud risk management program is working properly. We should have ongoing evaluation or separate evaluation. We're gonna talk about it in details later on. So here you see in the governance, we should have a fraud risk management policy, risk assessment, performs comprehensive fraud risk assessment. Why it's important comprehensive? I was an assignment reviewing risk management department. We have seen that they have risk register for all the department. However, for fraud, they have only one item, and every risk register, only one item related to fraud. So this is when we give them recommendation to have comprehensive, thorough fraud risk assessment. Again, control activity, we spoke about preventive, detective control, monitoring, and investigation. So what is fraud risk governance? Now, what does the principle say? So we should establish a fraud risk management program. This is the purpose from the principal program. So the board of directors and senior management, they should put their expectation. This is where they write a statement. For example, when they approve the fraud risk management policy and anti-fraud control policy signed by the board of directors, this means we are against fraud. We want to fight fraud. They should have a key RI, key risk indicator, for example, saying zero fraud tolerance, and their commitment to controls. Here, this is where it works later on when the management have put strong controls, and here we should have anti-fraud control policy. Later on, we see integrity and ethical values, managing fraud risk. This is why we should have code of conduct, code of ethics, where it talks about integrity, transparency, confidentiality, competency, and every individual should acknowledge that he read these policies, and he acknowledged that he will commit with the content of the policy. So fraud risk management policy. This is a sample from ACFE tool. All the items that are mentioned in this fraud risk management policy, we are gonna talk about it within this seminar. So you see policy statement, definitions, fraud control, who's responsible, role responsibility, fraud risk management program, fraud risk assessment, prevention and detection, all these elements within this fraud risk management policy, 8 pages. We will talk about it within this webinar. I strongly recommend that you take this sample and use it. For example, in the banks, I know in Oman and in Qatar, there is fraud risk management department. This is different than the anti-fraud and investigation department that is responsible for the review and the credit and account for fraud. I know multiple people, their job title is head of fraud risk management policy, head of fraud risk management department, or senior fraud risk manager. So fraud risk management is starting to be implemented within banks and financial institutions. There is fraud risk management survey. So this survey will help you when you want to start and build up fraud risk management program to understand where your organization stand. You can customize it. And when you will receive the survey, you will notice that they are talking about a survey about the COSO internal control framework, the 5 component crime. And they will have multiple questions, and you will have to agree, disagree. So if you disagree on a point, this is a weakness. This is a gap. This is where you should work on it. You should raise it to senior management, to the board, that you have to implement. For example, if you don't have code of ethics, code of conduct, whistleblowing policy, if you don't have whistleblowing policy, for example. So this survey is important to start with, to understand where you are and then build on it. Again, within fraud risk governance, we have very important tool from ACFE. This is high level assessment. This is for fraud risk governance. You will take this, you can call it survey or assessment tool, level, and you will ask the C-level or senior management about these questions. For example, do they have written code of business conduct, written fraud control policy? I believe it is 2 pages. It's many questions. Also, this is to start with to build up this fraud risk management program. For example, why fraud risk management is important now, and we are, for example, uh, for internal auditors, now it's required to do audit on fraud risk management program. This year in 2026, the IIA will release a fraud topical requirement, fraud risk management. Topical requirement is part of the standard, but it is mandatory. So when you have, and this is an indication that to consider this in the plan, and if you put it in the plan, audit plan, then you should use this topical requirement. Well, it's baseline for you as an internal auditor to when you are conducting audit on the fraud risk management program. Fraud risk assessment. So we should have comprehensive fraud risk assessment, not only one line item in a risk register. So I have 15 department, I have 15 risk register. I'm updating it every 3 months. But however, I put only one item for fraud risk. How and others risk are related to financial, compliance, strategy, operational. No, it's not enough. I prefer to have a fraud risk register separate than the risk assessment, the risk register related to the normal risk, the other risk universe. So, perform comprehensive fraud risk assessment. We should have identified fraud scheme and risk. This is why we take the fraud tree in front of us to help us, where it have a lot of indications what fraud scheme can be. And we assess here the likelihood and the impact. And then we put the control, and this control also we should assess it. Is the control effective, ineffective, or partially effective? And then we will include, we will put the scoring, likelihood and impact for inherent risk, and then for residual risk after the control in place. If the control is medium, however, the risk appetite should be low for these risks, what we should put, we should have risk response strategy and put action plan and target date and who's the owner. We'll discuss it now in another slide. So this about fraud risk assessment principle, which is linked to the COSO component 2 of risk assessment. So this is a risk assessment template from ACFE. You can see here they have the fraud risk and scheme. For example, fraud, disbursement, or conflict of interest. Then they will have the likelihood and significance where it's risk scoring. It can be quantifiable and or qualifiable. I like to use both of them. Put numbers, however, link every number to high, low, medium, severe, and so on. Then they put the owners, and then they put that as the anti-fraud controls, because these are control are specific to tackle the fraud risk. And then is this control preventive or detective or combined? This is based on the best practices for internal controls. And then is this control effective or ineffective or partially effective? So here you can see scoring from 1 to 5. And what is the risk rating for residual risk? And what we should put for the action plan for this risk to reduce it. So this is a simple template. You can customize it. I will show you now another template. It's more detailed. So this is the fraud risk register I personally use when I was in a public listed company. I was head of risk management committee. So we were facilitating the risk management function, and there is risk owner, risk champion. So what happened? We had a normal risk management function without fraud risk. And then the external auditor informed us that based of corporate governance, we should have a fraud risk register and improve and revise our risk management policy and procedure to include fraud risk. So we did a new risk management policy. We included a fraud risk management in it, and also the risk management procedure manual. We revised it to include fraud risk register. So here, so we did fraud risk register for every department. Here we included the fraud triangles, opportunity, pressure, rationalization, and where you can drop down list and you can choose each fraud. This is related to what fraud triangle, or it can be integrated one, two, or three. Then we will put the fraud scenario. Then we'll put the fraud risk, cause, and consequence. So I prefer to use the bow tie model. So it will be clear what is the event or the risk here, and then the cause and the consequence, when this fraud was raised, and who's the risk owner. And of course, we continue with the fraud risk register, the normal. We put the likelihood, the impact, the risk scoring, and then the control activity, the control in place, and then residual risk, and then risk response strategy. But this is the main part that was different than the normal risk register, and we had fraud risk register for every department. So while preparing this fraud risk register, we were doing brainstorming session, focus group. We were sitting with the risk champion. Before that, also we did fraud risk awareness. We did a lot of trainings about fraud, what can be fraud. We used the fraud tree, and we have fraud risk exposure. We're gonna discuss it later. So now we have a question. Please, we would want you to answer us in the chat.
Chat box. We want to see your answers, okay?
Yes, this is a very easy question. These are from the CFE exam questions. So if you are getting it right, you will pass the CFE for sure. What is the objective of fraud risk assessment? Is it to provide an estimate of organization fraud loss, or to establish the guilt or innocence of an employee suspected of committing fraud, or to assess the design and effectiveness of organization internal control or financial reporting, or to help an organization identify what makes it most vulnerable to fraud? Let me see the chat.
I will read them for you.
Okay.
We have C's, we have D's, and we have 1A. Okay, and we have between C and D. So,
Between C and D.
yeah,
Okay, first of all, it's a good sign that nobody chose B, because B, no fraud examiner or internal auditor can say a person is innocent or guilty. Only the court can say that. We can say we have evidence that there is potential fraud here and red flag in this area. However, we cannot say if someone is guilty or innocent. Regarding C, it's not C because it's not to assess design effectiveness of organization internal control over financial reporting. So this is not ICOFAR assessment. Fraud risk assessment. There is a specific risk control matrix and testing for ICOFAR. ICOFAR is similar to SOX in USA. This is where public listed company are obliged to use it. It's not A for sure, an estimate to organization fraud loss. So it's D. It's to help organization identify what makes it most vulnerable to fraud. We say fraud risk is vulnerability of organization when individual combine all the fraud triangle to commit fraud. So it's identify what make it most vulnerable to fraud. So fraud risk example, how to prepare the fraud risk assessment. There is a very good tool from ACFE. This tool have I believe hundreds of fraud risk examples. So when you want to prepare the fraud risk register, you sit down, you click on each, for example, fictitious revenue. If you click on it, you will have at least 20, 30 examples. So this is a very good Why you want to from scratch to build it? You have examples. You take what is the fraud risk that can happen in every department, section, and sub and process, and you use these example from ACFE. Respond to residual fraud risk. So still we are doing the fraud risk assessment at the end of the fraud risk register when the risk rating of residual risk is, for example, medium or high, and you want to reduce it, you should have a plan. We call it risk response strategy. So we have avoid. Avoid is when we avoid a risk, eliminate a risk. Stop. For example, we want to open a branch in a new country or a new region in a country. And then we make the study, we believe that there is it will not be profitable or there is some natural disaster happening. So here we eliminate the risk, we avoid the risk, we don't open this new project or new region. Transfer or share. This will we have insurance, workman compensation insurance. When we have health insurance, fire insurance, for doctors, malpractice insurance. Or when we share or transfer the risk to third-party services. When we get a company to do IT services for us, partially of the IT service for us. Then we have mitigate, reduce. This is where we implement controls, preventive controls or detective controls to reduce the risk. This is the most used, and for sure we have to use most of the time. And then we have assume or accept the risk. This is when the risk is low. We keep it in the fraud risk register or in the normal register. However, we keep on monitoring it. And we check if the controls are still there and being implemented and the owners are still the same and champion is still the same. This is where we accept or assume the risk. Another question for risk response strategy. So please, if you can answer us in the chat box. So in response to a risk identified during fraud risk assessment, so management decide to implement appropriate countermeasures. So they want to implement some controls, preventive and detective controls. So this risk response strategy is known as what? When we have fraud risk assessment and the management want to implement appropriate controls. Is it avoid the risk or transfer or assume or mitigate?
Okay, we started to receive some answers. It's mainly D and one answer, one A answer, mainly D.
Okay.
We have more than 10 Ds.
So correct, it's D. Of course. Fraud control activities. So here it's about having proper controls, preventive control, detective controls. So when we develop preventive, detective, fraud controls to mitigate fraud risk, as we have seen practically in the fraud risk assessment tool or in the fraud risk register, when we put the controls in place. So what are the preventive controls? Is the control that helps protect the company before they occur, any risk before it occur. For example, segregation of duties, separation of conflict of interest. When we say segregation of duties, this is when we have the most famous one is ARC, authorization, recording, and custody. We have table of financial authority, delegation of authority, approved policy procedure, organization structure, hired qualified employees, anti-fraud training. These are all examples of preventive controls. We should input as much as possible preventive control to reduce risk of happening before it occurs. And then we have detective controls, bank reconciliation, performance evaluation, surprise audit. This is when it will reveal a risk after their occurrence. So, but it's important detective control as well to have it. Surprise audit is very important, especially for cash or inventory. Fraud investigation and corrective action. In this principle, this is how we communicate the potential fraud. We should have maybe a committee that have its own charter and policy, how we do the investigation and how we do the corrective action. who's responsible, who's the investigation team. So this is fraud investigation and corrective action, and it should be on timely matter to address potential fraud again. For example, whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is when we do it's tips is the most used to conceal fraud, to potential fraud. So we can have whistleblowing by website, phone numbers, emails. So when I was an internal audit manager in a public sector company, whistleblowing policy was under the audit committee was responsible for the whistleblowing. And in the policy, it was mentioned that the internal audit manager should receive by email any red flags or potential fraud. So I was receiving the emails, studied the case, and then based on that, if there's enough evidence, we make a fraud investigation team, and then we move on to investigate and then make a report to the audit committee. Fraud risk management monitoring activity. So this is when we develop ongoing evaluation for the 5 principles of the fraud risk management. Is it functioning? Is it existing? And how we communicate this deficiency. This is like internal quality assessment on yourself, ongoing evaluation. And it can be also separate evaluation when you get the internal audit department to audit the fraud risk management policy, fraud risk management program. And what is the corrective action to improve if some of the principles are not being followed? A question about the fraud risk management monitoring activity. So please,
We
if you can
want
give
your
us your answers in
answers.
the
Yeah.
chat. This all the questions are from ACFE. So guys, after this, you will study CFE and go pass the exam.
Definitely. We have
Fraud
one
risk
answer
management
true.
program. Yes.
Go ahead if you want to read the question.
Yes. So a fraud risk management program must include system specifically designed to monitor, identify, and address breach in compliance. So of course the question is true. This is in fraud risk monitoring activities.
We have all true answers.
Okay,
True,
great.
true, A, true, A, true, true. So all of them have the
Great.
right answer.
So now we're
Perfect.
gonna move to COSO, internal control, COSO fraud risk management. So we just want to understand that these fraud principles are linked to COSO internal control components. So we see control environment related to fraud risk governance, risk assessment, control activities, information communication related to investigation and corrective action, and monitoring activity is considered as linked to fraud monitoring activities. So in the cause internal control, we have the 5 components and 17 principles. We're gonna not talk about it in details. However, just remember it's crime to have not to have a good system of internal control. Crime is mnemonic of the 5 component. C for control environment, R for risk assessment, I for information communication, M for monitoring, and E for existing control activity. We just add the existing. As we know, the control environment is very important. This is the foundation. We have board independence, accountability. We have the code of ethics, we have a proper organization structure and reporting line. The risk assessment is the same. We have already established objective, and then we identify the risk, evaluate the risk. And here, the component risk assessment, principle 8, this is where we have considered fraud risk assessment. Based on this is one of the main factors. The fraud risk management guide was created by COSO and ACFE together. The control activity, we have proper controls, preventive, deductive, manual, and related to technology, proper policy procedures. And then we have the information communication, internal communication, external communication, the flow of the information to have proper internal controls, the monitoring activity, separate and ongoing and separate evaluation happening. When we say separate, it can be by risk management department, or it can be by quality assurance, or if second line model, or it can be by the internal audit department as independent. Now we're going to talk about the fraud risk management program. So from the principle, we build the program. It's the same. we're not gonna repeat the details. So we should have fraud risk governance policy. We said at whistleblowing policy, code of conduct policy, fraud risk management policy, anti-fraud control policy, fraud risk assessment. We have the fraud risk management policy, and then we have fraud or risk management procedure manual, which include details about how to prepare fraud risk assessment for risk register. When then we have we develop preventive detective controls, and then we will have the investigation and corrective actions, and we monitor and evaluate the fraud risk management program. So as you've seen, the fraud risk management program comes from the principle. So the principle is the standard for us. The program is starting implementing it. Then we have the process. So principle, then program, then the process, procedure manual. So here we'll have fraud risk management policy. Then we will do the comprehensive fraud risk assessment. We have the preventive detective controls, and then we will establish the reporting, investigation, and corrective action. And then we have the monitoring for the fraud risk management program. So it's all the same component, however, different terminology and building up from the standard to the process. What is the fraud risk management program component? So these are important to know. So the main component are statement of commitment. The board and senior management should commit in writing. So when they are signing, approving fraud risk management policy, fraud under control, a written statement, key risk indicators, zero tolerance for fraud, they are committed. There should be fraud awareness for training for the people. We should not be afraid to talk about fraud, potential fraud of happening. We should have clear discussion about fraud. A formation process when all the employees and even the contractors read a firm signing that they have read, understood the code of conduct, fraud control policy, fraud risk management policy. It should be in written. Disclosure of any conflict of interest by the employees. So any new hire employee should sign that there is no conflict of interest. The board members also should sign there is no conflict of interest. Even with the vendors and clients, I have seen it, and it should be a best practice to sign no conflict of interest. Fraud risk assessment, a thorough, comprehensive fraud risk assessment. These are all the components of a successful, effective fraud risk management program. Reporting procedure. How is the reporting? Again, fraud is detected more often by tips. Second, as per the study of ACFE, is internal auditors. So we should have a whistleblowing policy, and we should protect the whistleblower. Not if someone will identify some potential fraud and then he will be punished and terminated from the company. We should have proper investigation process for who is the team, how to gather the team, based on what, to make the report, give it to the responsible committee, and then to take corrective action. And the corrective action here, we can terminate an employee, terminate contract with a vendor, go to court, and then even sometimes external reporting to regulators for public listed companies. Then we have the compliance monitoring. This is how to monitor the fraud risk management program. So we should monitoring it ongoing or separate evaluation by the internal auditor, or we get third party, or if there is a quality assurance department, he can review within the KPI at the end of the year. Now we're gonna talk about responsibilities. So who is responsible for the fraud risk management program? Board and audit committee have oversight. Management is ownership. They are ultimate responsible, primary responsible. Internal audit, he will do independent assurance on the fraud risk management program. This is why now the IIA will release the topical requirement. It will be obligatory to use this topical requirement for the for the fraud risk management program. And then we have the employees, first line. So all the employees are responsible for the fraud risk management, the prevention and detection. We have a question here. According to fraud risk management guide, who has the responsibility for fraud deterrence, prevention, and detection? Is it the
If you
board?
can mention the answer in the chat box, please.
Yes. Is it the board? Is it the senior management, executive management, internal audit, or personnel at all levels? So who has the responsibility for fraud deterrence, prevention, and detection?
Okay, we have two A's, one D, one B, C, D, C. We have a
Okay.
mix.
So it's not the board. Board is oversight. Executive management, if the question was mentioning primary responsible or owner or ultimately responsible, is executive management or senior management. Internal audit is only responsible to audit the fraud risk management program, or in the IIS standard 9.4 for audit plan, he should consider fraud risk when preparing the audit plan. So who is responsible for this is all the personnel in the organization. So this we will not read all of this, just an overview. For example, overall role is the board of directors, oversight, and audit committee. Senior management is accountable to implement the fraud risk management program. Tone of and ethics, ethical value, transparency, accountability is over expectation from the board that everyone should have this. Management should set and demonstrate this tone. For example, let's read about use of assurance and expertise. This is where we use the input from internal audit and external audit. For example, the external auditor, there is a standard, international standard of auditing 240. He's responsible when doing external audit work to consider fraud risk. So this is a summary from the fraud risk management guide to who is responsible between senior management and these areas. And then we have this ACFE tool that is very important. For example, it will tell you who is primary responsible, who is secondary responsible, or shared responsibility. And for example, oversight is the board. If you see code of conduct and code of principle is executive management, they are primary responsible, and so on. Please, this tool is very important when you are to prepare the governance for the fraud risk management and who is responsible. You should use this tool from ACFE. Now, a question regarding responsibility. So please, if you can answer us in the chat. As part of fraud related responsibility, the committee should meet regularly with the chief audit executive to discuss identified fraud risk, and these steps should be taken to prevent detected fraud. Is it true or false? So audit committee will discuss with chief audit executive regarding fraud risk.
Okay, we have A, true, 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 A,
Excellent. It's true, of
A,
course.
true. All right.
So we finished the webinar. So
It
what
was
are the key
very
takeaway?
insightful, really.
Yes. So fraud cannot be eliminated. We cannot say we have zero fraud, 100%. Even management might make override of controls. There might be collusion with the vendor. Might be some espionage from the competitor. In internal fraud or external fraud, cybersecurity hacking that we are not aware of. So it cannot be eliminated, but can be managed with the proper comprehensive fraud risk management program. Then we should have strong fraud risk management that create deterrence. For me, deterrence is to discourage fraud attempt before fraud has happened. It's about mindset and culture. It's about people must believe that fraud will be caught and punished. So this where we increase, we make a stronger fraud risk management. Then we should start with fraud risk governance. We do the high level assessment, we use the survey, we build the fraud risk management policy, we start with fraud risk register, and then we continue with the remaining element from the principle or program, and we monitoring it. So we should have fraud risk management program that have all the principles to be able to build this fraud risk management and prevent fraud. Even detecting fraud is also important. However, if we can prevent before it happens, is much better by using strong preventive controls. So we finished. We will see who have any questions. But before the questions, we want to encourage everyone to obtain the Certified Fraud Examiner certification. Please feel free to communicate with ACFE Lebanon Chapter uh, to attend the course or to communicate with me on my LinkedIn. I will share my LinkedIn link at the end. CFE is a very important certification. For example, I remember when I was studying it, really the four topics, the four exams, you will have a lot of new information that you don't study with CIA or CPA or CMA, about the investigation techniques, about the fraud tree, how the mindset of the fraudster, the theory of the fraudster, so you will gain a lot of information. The exam is not very difficult. They want you to know the knowledge and the skills, and the question are not tricky as the CIA or CPA. So I believe everyone who will put proper time and effort for the CFE will pass the exam. Hopefully, you contact ACFE Lebanon chapter, or you can contact me to prepare and study and pass the CFE exam and